I pulled on my safety gloves and checked the pressure gauge one more time. 43 years in industrial electrical systems will teach you to trust the numbers, not the people. The numbers that morning told me the main distribution panel at the Whitmore cold storage facility was running hot, dangerously hot, and that if I didn't isolate the fault in the next 2 hours, we were looking at a cascade failure that would take down every refrigeration unit in a building that held $11 million worth of pharmaceutical inventory. My name is Douglas Merritt. I turned 63 last February, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades keeping the lights on, literally, at facilities across northern Ontario. I started as an apprentice electrician out of Sudbury when I was 19 years old, working for a small contractor who paid me $11 an hour and told me I'd never amount to much. I proved him wrong about 30 years before I retired, and then I proved him wrong again after that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That morning, a Tuesday in late October, cold enough that my breath fogged inside the building's loading dock, I was 3 hours into what should have been a routine thermal inspection. Whitmore Cold Storage had brought me in as an independent contractor, the same way they'd been bringing me in for the past 6 years, whenever something serious needed attention. I had history with this facility. I knew where every junction box was buried, which conduit runs had been improperly supported during the 1998 renovation, and exactly why the Phase B transformer in the secondary substation ran 2 degrees warmer than the manufacturer's spec. I knew this building the way a family doctor knows a long-term patient, not just the charts, but the whole story underneath them. The fault I was chasing that morning had started showing up 3 weeks earlier as intermittent voltage irregularities on the monitoring system. The facility's own maintenance crew had looked at it twice and declared it resolved both times. It wasn't resolved. It was getting worse. The operations manager, a woman I'd worked with before named Sandra Okafor, had called me on a Friday afternoon and said, "Douglas, something is wrong, and my people can't find it." I drove out the following Monday and confirmed what I already suspected from the data logs she'd emailed me. There was a developing fault somewhere in the medium voltage distribution system, and it was going to announce itself in a very dramatic fashion if nobody found it first. So there I was on that Tuesday morning, working methodically through the primary switchgear with my thermal imaging camera, cross-referencing what I was seeing with the load data I'd pulled from the building management system. Sandra had stopped by at 7:30 to check on my progress and bring me a coffee, which I'd accepted gratefully. She'd asked me how long I thought it would take. I'd told her honestly another 3 to 4 hours, possibly longer if the fault was intermittent, and decided not to show itself. "Whatever it takes," she said. "You know what's at stake if we lose refrigeration." I did know. Pharmaceutical cold storage is not a situation where you get a second chance. The inventory in that building included temperature-sensitive medications, biologics, and materials destined for hospitals across the region. A refrigeration failure of any significant duration would mean product loss measured in the millions, regulatory reporting obligations, and potentially delayed treatments for patients who couldn't wait. Sandra knew all of this. I knew all of this. We both understood exactly what we were dealing with. I found the first anomaly at around 9:15. A connection point on the main feeder to the north refrigeration block was showing a temperature differential that shouldn't have been there. Not catastrophic yet, but the thermal signature was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. I photographed it, noted the location, and kept moving. In situations like this, finding one problem usually means there are others nearby. The fault that causes the failure is rarely alone. I was working through the secondary connections when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I had a policy about phone calls during active diagnostic work. They wait. But I recognized the number as belonging to the Office of Regional Director of Operations for the contracting firm that had actually issued my work order. A man named Paul Devereaux. I had dealt with Paul's office before, mostly through his assistant, and it was never anything urgent. I assumed it was an administrative matter about the invoice for a previous job. I set down my camera and answered. It wasn't Paul's assistant. It was Paul himself. "Douglas," he said, "I'm glad I caught you." Something in his voice was off. I've been around long enough to recognize the particular tone a man uses when he's about to tell you something he's been rehearsing. It's a very specific flatness, controlled, careful, emptied of anything that might invite a real conversation. "I'm in the middle of an active inspection," I said. "Can this wait a few hours?" "I'm afraid not," he said. "I'm calling to let you know that effective immediately, we're restructuring our independent contractor relationships. We won't be renewing your agreement when it expires at the end of the month. We're moving to a centralized service model with a national provider. I stood very still in that switchgear room. The hum of the building's electrical systems was all around me, a sound I knew so well it had long since become background noise, like breathing. I listened to it for a moment. "Paul," I said, "I am currently inside the Whitmore facility performing an active fault diagnosis on a medium voltage system that is 3 to 4 hours away from potentially taking down $11 million worth of refrigerated pharmaceutical inventory." There was a pause. "I understand the timing is not ideal," he said. Not ideal. Those 3 words told me everything I needed to know about how Paul Devereaux understood the situation I was standing in. Not ideal. As if I had mentioned an inconvenient scheduling conflict. As if I were describing a meeting that overlapped with a lunch reservation. "I want to make sure I understand this correctly," I said, keeping my voice very even. "You are terminating my contract while I am physically on site, mid-inspection, on a critical infrastructure fault. The decision was made at the regional level," he said. "I don't have flexibility on the timing." I thought about the thermal image still on my camera. I thought about the connection point I'd photographed 20 minutes earlier. I thought about Sandra Okafor upstairs in her office, trusting that the problem was being found. I thought about the hospitals across the region that would be waiting for products sitting in this building. And then I thought about 43 years. 43 years of showing up before dawn. 43 years of answering calls on Christmas Eve, and driving through February blizzards, and crawling through ceiling spaces that no man my age should be crawling through. 43 years of being the person they called when nobody else could figure it out. 43 years of being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that I should be grateful for the work, that I should make myself small enough to fit inside whatever box was most convenient for the people signing the checks. "All right, Paul," I said. "I'll make note of the termination effective today." "We appreciate your understanding," he started. "I'll need to inform Sandra Okafor that the inspection is being discontinued," I said. "She'll want to know that the fault diagnosis is incomplete and that your national provider will need to be briefed on what I've found so far. Do you want to make that call, or should I?" Another pause. Longer this time. "What do you mean, discontinued?" "My contract is terminated effective immediately," I said. "That means my engagement with this facility ends now. I'll pack up my equipment, document the current state of the inspection for handover purposes, and let Sandra know that your national provider will be taking over. She'll need to reach out to them directly to arrange continuity. I'd recommend she do that quickly, given the nature of what I've found. Douglas, you can't just walk off a job in the middle." "Paul," I said, and I let my voice drop into the register I'd earned over 4 decades, the register that meant I was done explaining. "You just ended my contract. Effective immediately," you said. "I'm respecting your decision. Whoever your national provider is, I'm sure they'll be able to pick up where I left off. Though I will tell you, what I've found so far is going to require someone with very specific knowledge of medium voltage distribution systems, and at least some familiarity with this building's particular history. But that's not my concern anymore. Good luck." I ended the call. I stood there for another moment, listening to the building hum around me. Then I packed my thermal imaging camera into its case, gathered my documentation, and went upstairs to find Sandra. She was in her office reviewing inventory reports. She looked up when I knocked on the open door, and something in my expression must have told her immediately that this was not a routine update. "What's wrong?" she said. I sat down across from her desk and told her exactly what had happened. I told her about Paul's call. I told her about the termination. I told her what I'd found so far, the anomalous thermal signature on the north feeder connection, the pattern in the load data that suggested there might be additional stress points in the same distribution branch. I gave her my documentation photographs, readings, notes, and I told her that her facility's contracting firm had just told me to stop. Sandra stared at me for a long moment. "They terminated your contract," she said. "Today, while you were finding the fault." "That's correct." She was quiet for a moment. I could see her processing it, not just the logistics, but the full scope of what it meant. She was a smart woman, and she understood immediately. "Who is their national provider?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Paul didn't mention a name. Do they have someone who can be here today?" I said nothing. That wasn't my question to answer. Sandra picked up her phone. I excused myself and went to the parking lot to sit in my truck. It was cold enough that I started the engine for the heat. I sat there and watched a crow pick at something on the edge of the lot and thought about what 43 years actually adds up to when someone decides it's no longer convenient. I drove home. My wife Elaine was in the kitchen when I came through the door at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning, which was not something that happened. She took one look at me and said, "Sit down. I'll put the kettle on." I told her the whole story while she made tea. Elaine had been listening to my work stories for 38 years. She had heard versions of every kind of situation a man can encounter in a long career, the gratitude and the ingratitude, the competence and the incompetence, the politics and the pettiness. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. When I finished, she set a mug in front of me and sat down across the table. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Wait," I said. She nodded. She understood exactly what I meant. The call came the next morning. Not from Paul Devereaux. From Sandra Okafor, directly, on my personal cell. "Douglas," she said, "I need to talk to you off the record." I told her to go ahead. She had called the contracting firm's national provider the previous afternoon. They had a team available in the GTA who theoretically handled industrial electrical systems. She had explained the situation: active fault, medium voltage distribution, pharmaceutical cold storage, time sensitive. They had asked her to send over the building's electrical drawings and had promised to review them and get back to her. They got back to her that morning. They could have someone on site in 4 days. They were not familiar with medium voltage distribution fault diagnosis specifically, but their technician had general experience with commercial electrical systems and would do his best. 4 days. The thermal imaging I'd done the previous morning had shown a connection running at a temperature differential that, based on my experience, had roughly a 48 to 72-hour window before it became a failure event. 4 days was not a timeline that the building could safely accommodate. Sandra knew this. She'd done her own research overnight after talking to her in-house maintenance team. "I want to hire you directly," she said. "Not through the contracting firm. You, personally, as an independent contractor. Today." I was quiet for a moment. "Sandra," I said, "you understand that changes the financial arrangement. I've been billing through the firm at their negotiated rate. Direct engagement for a critical fault diagnosis of this nature, emergency response, medium voltage, pharmaceutical infrastructure that's a different rate structure." "I understand," she said. "Name your rate." I named my rate. It was not modest. It reflected the 43 years, the specialized equipment I owned outright, the fact that I was the person who had already found part of the problem and understood the building's history, and the reality that the alternative was a 4-day wait and a technician who had never worked on a system like this one. Sandra didn't hesitate. "When can you be here?" she said. I was on site by 9 that morning with a signed engagement letter, my own liability coverage documented, and a very clear scope of work that included a written report, photographic documentation, and a formal handover package at completion. The things I had never insisted on when I was working through the contracting firm, because I had trusted the relationship and believed the relationship was enough. I found the second fault point within 90 minutes of arriving. It was in exactly the area the load data had suggested a degraded connection on the feeder to the east refrigeration block, showing a thermal profile almost identical to the one I'd photographed the previous day. If both of these connections had failed simultaneously, under full load, the cascading effect on the building's electrical system would have been catastrophic. We're talking about a potential event that would have taken the facility offline for a minimum of 2 weeks, assuming the physical damage to the distribution equipment wasn't severe enough to require complete replacement. The total value of the pharmaceutical inventory that would have been compromised. Sandra's team calculated it at just over $14 million, when they included the materials that had arrived since my first estimate. I had the repairs completed, the connections properly torqued and treated, and the system tested and verified by 4:30 that afternoon. I stayed an additional hour to run a full thermal sweep of the repaired sections and document everything. I wrote my report in the parking lot before I drove home, because I believe in completing things properly before the details fade. My invoice reflected 7.5 hours at my emergency rate, plus materials, plus the documentation package. It was the largest single-day invoice I had ever submitted in my professional life. Sandra approved it that evening by email without a single question. I heard, through a contact I have at another facility in the region, that Paul Devereaux's office had reached out to Whitmore Cold Storage several weeks later to discuss reinstating the service relationship. I was told third hand, so I can't verify the exact words, that Sandra had thanked them for their call and indicated that the facility had made other arrangements. Those other arrangements were a 2-year direct contract with me, at the rate I had charged for that one day, with a scope that covered quarterly inspections, emergency response, and an ongoing consulting relationship for any capital projects involving the electrical infrastructure. It was more work, at better terms, than I had ever negotiated through the contracting firm in 6 years of working with them. I want to be honest about something, because I think honesty is the most important thing I can offer at this point in my life. That day in October was not a comfortable day. Sitting in my truck in a cold parking lot, having just walked away from a job I had not finished, felt terrible, not righteous, not satisfying. Terrible. I am a man who finishes what he starts. Leaving that building with the fault partially diagnosed went against something fundamental in how I understand myself. There is a version of this story where I tell you I walked out with my head high and a calm certainty that everything would work out. That version is not true. I drove home in October, cold, and sat across from my wife and drank tea, and did not know what was going to happen. I was 62 years old, and I had just lost a steady contract that I had depended on. The pride came later. In the moment, there was only the uncertainty. I tell you that because I think it matters. There is a tendency, when we talk about standing up for ourselves professionally, to skip past the uncomfortable middle part, the hours or days between the moment you draw the line and the moment you find out whether it was the right thing to do. That middle part is real, and it is hard, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. What gets you through it is not confidence that you'll be proven right. It's the knowledge that you made a decision consistent with your own values, and that you can live with it regardless of what comes next. What I had was not swagger. What I had was the understanding that I had spent 43 years building something real, real knowledge, real relationships, a real reputation, and that if the people I was working with couldn't see the value in that, then the problem was not with the value. The problem was with their ability to see it. I have watched a lot of experienced tradespeople and technicians undervalue themselves over the years, not because they lacked skill, but because they had been conditioned to be grateful for whatever was offered, to be easy, to accommodate, to not make trouble. I did it myself for decades. The idea that your expertise has a market value, that you are not just a convenient body to fill a role, but someone whose specific knowledge and experience represents something genuinely scarce, and therefore genuinely worth paying for, is one that took me far too long to fully understand. My father's generation had a different relationship with work. You found a good employer, you gave them your loyalty, and you trusted that the relationship would be honored. That model worked, for a while, in certain industries, for certain people. What it didn't prepare you for was the moment when the employer decided, for reasons entirely unrelated to your performance or value, to restructure, consolidate, or renegotiate. That moment, when it came, left a lot of good people without the tools to respond, because they had built their identity entirely inside a relationship that turned out to be conditional. What October taught me, or reminded me, because I had learned this lesson and forgotten it, and needed to learn it again, is that your security does not come from any single contract or employer or relationship. It comes from what you know how to do, and from your willingness to make sure that what you know how to do is properly valued. Those are two different things, and you need both. Knowing your craft is necessary. Knowing how to ensure your craft is compensated appropriately is equally necessary, and it is a skill that nobody teaches you, and that you have to learn, usually the hard way, usually more than once. I had a conversation with my youngest son Martin about this, about a month after everything was resolved. Martin is in his early 30s, works in project management, and was listening to me tell the story around the dinner table one Sunday. When I finished, he said, "Dad, how did you know she'd call back?" I told him I didn't know. I had a reasonable belief, based on understanding the situation clearly, the timeline, the technical requirements, the lack of qualified alternatives. But knowing and believing are different things, and I want to be accurate. I believed she would call back because the facts of the situation supported it. I did not know. What if she hadn't? He said. I thought about it for a moment. Then I would have found other work, I said. At my rate. Because that's what my work is worth. The question was never whether she would call back. The question was whether I was willing to be the person who knew what his work was worth, regardless of what any particular client decided. Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way you nod when something lands somewhere real. I think about that conversation often. I think it contains the most important thing I know about building a working life that holds up, not just financially, but in terms of who you are when you look at yourself at the end of a long day. Know what you do. Know what it's worth. Be willing to say so, calmly and clearly, and then let the other person decide. If they decide correctly, you have a good engagement. If they decide incorrectly, you have learned something about whether that was ever a relationship worth preserving. You cannot control what other people value. You can only control whether you participate in your own undervaluation. I am 63 years old. I have more work than I can comfortably handle, at rates that reflect what that work actually costs to do correctly. I have contracts with 3 facilities in Northern Ontario, 2 ongoing consulting relationships with engineering firms in the region, and a waiting list for new clients. I turn work away when it doesn't meet my standards, financially or professionally, and I do so without apology. I am also, for the first time in my career, genuinely relaxed about the future. Not because I have certainty, nobody has certainty, but because I understand that my security is located inside my own knowledge and my own willingness to defend its value. Nobody can restructure that away. Nobody can replace it with a national provider. It goes where I go. That cold October morning, standing in a switchgear room, with a thermal camera in my hand when my phone rang, I didn't know it yet, but that was the morning I stopped working for the relationship and started working for the work itself. The distinction sounds small. It is not small. It turned out to be the most important professional decision I ever made, and I didn't even fully realize I was making it until I was already sitting in a cold truck watching a crow in a parking lot, wondering what came next. What came next was better than what came before. It almost always is, when you decide to stop accepting terms that don't reflect reality and start insisting, quietly and without drama, on terms that do. That is the only advice I have that I am fully certain of. Everything else I've told you is just the story. But that part, know your value, say it out loud, and hold the line. That part I will stand behind without reservation, at 63 or any other age. The numbers don't lie, and neither, in the end, does time.